Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so let's dive into Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s time in Chicago back in 1966.
Yeah.
We're using Mr. Hutchings History today
Oh, excellent source.
to kind of look at this kind of lesser-known chapter of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating period. King shifts from tackling de jure segregation,
Right.
which is, what we see in the Jim Crow South.
Enforced by law.
Exactly. Moves north, and he's confronting de facto segregation.
Now, just for anyone listening who needs a quick reminder, what exactly is the difference between de jure and de facto segregation?
So de jure is segregation by law.
Oh, okay.
Those separate but equal policies that were all over the South.
Mm-hmm.
De facto segregation is a little bit trickier.
Okay.
It exists in practice, even if there aren't specific laws on the books.
So even if laws say one thing,
Right.
the reality on the ground can be very different.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
Chicago's a perfect example.
Okay, how so?
We had all these discriminatory practices, real estate agents,
Oh, wow.
housing covenants. These were agreements that restricted who could buy or rent property in certain areas.
Oh, right.
And even just straight up intimidation tactics.
Seriously?
Yeah. All of that contributed to keeping Black families confined to impoverished neighborhoods,
Wow.
even though there weren't laws explicitly saying they couldn't live elsewhere.
It's almost like this invisible barrier.
Right.
They should be able to live wherever they choose, but these forces are holding them back.
Exactly. And that's the backdrop for King's arrival in Chicago in '66.
So he gets to Chicago,
Yeah.
and he sees housing discrimination as the core issue.
Yeah, that's right.
That seems like a real shift for King.
It is a shift.
Mhm.
He still recognizes those political rights are paramount, but he really starts to understand that true equality also requires economic justice and fair housing.
Right.
And so this marks, I think, a really important turning point in the evolution of the civil rights movement.
So King's in Chicago. He's identified housing discrimination as the battleground.
Yeah.
What does he do?
He starts organizing marches to expose that reality of de facto segregation.
These marches weren't just leisurely walks, I'm assuming.
No, not at all. Imagine 500 Black marchers
Wow.
led by King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference,
Yeah.
marching right into white neighborhoods.
Places they were legally allowed to be.
Exactly.
Mm.
But they were prevented from being there because of all those forces we talked about.
I can already sense this isn't going to be a peaceful protest.
You got it.
So what happened?
The reaction from white residents was intense. Rocks bottles,
Really?
racial slurs.
Wow.
It went beyond just disagreeing. It was real hostility.
And this wasn't the Deep South.
Yeah.
This was Chicago.
Yeah, 1966.
Yeah, it's kind of jarring to think about that level of hatred in a place that's supposed to be more progressive than the South.
It is. And one of the most impactful moments came when King himself was struck by a rock.
Oh, wow.
That image of King, this staunch advocate for nonviolence, being attacked, it really brought this issue of de facto segregation in the North into the national spotlight.
So even though the marches faced this fierce opposition,
Right.
they succeeded in shining a light on this problem.
They did. And, it's important to examine this event
Yeah.
from several different historical perspectives.
All right, I'm all ears. What are historians saying about all this?
Well, historians have kind of different opinions
Okay.
about the significance of King's Chicago campaign.
Yeah.
Some see it as this turning point,
Okay.
exposing the limitations of those legal victories achieved in the South
Right.
and propelling the movement to confront the reality of economic inequality.
Right.
Others, though, they believe its impact has been overstated.
Mm.
They point to the limited concrete changes that actually came about.
So it sounds like there's a real debate
Yeah,
among historians about how effective this campaign actually was.
there is.
So how do we make sense of all this? What makes this campaign stand out in the broader narrative of the civil rights movement?
It's complex. But what we can say is that the Chicago campaign really challenged the prevailing narrative of the civil rights movement at the time.
So this is 1966.
Right.
The focus had been on dismantling that legal segregation in the South.
Yeah.
And a lot of folks thought,
Right.
that would lead to broader equality.
And King's efforts in Chicago, they reveal this deeper,
Yeah.
more systemic problem.
Like what?
The economic inequality that was woven into the fabric of northern cities.
So it was kind of like saying, hey,
Yeah.
we need to look beyond these legal battles
Hmm.
and tackle the economic roots of this inequality.
Exactly. And this shift in focus wasn't just some theoretical debate.
Yeah.
It played out in the streets of Chicago.
So how did that actually happen?
Well, for one thing, social historians,
Okay.
they highlight how the violence that was directed at those marchers,
Right.
it exposed the hypocrisy of the North's claim to racial tolerance.
Because this was supposed to be the, more progressive part of the country.
Exactly. It shattered this myth that racism was just a Southern problem.
Wow.
And then you have urban historians.
Okay.
They see this as a classic case of white flight,
Oh, right.
where residents, often driven by fear and prejudice,
Right.
they abandoned neighborhoods
Mm-hmm.
as black families started moving in.
Interesting.
They worried about property values declining,
Mm-hmm.
and the changing character of their communities.
It's kind of fascinating how these anxieties,
Mm.
often rooted in misinformation and prejudice, really fueled so much resistance to integration.
It is.
And it's tragic because, it ignored these systemic factors that were really contributing to those economic disparities.
Absolutely. And then you've got the revisionist perspective.
Okay, tell me about that.
Revisionist historians, they argued that Chicago exposed the limitations of the Southern civil rights victories.
Okay.
Yeah. Legal segregation was being dismantled, but these deep economic inequalities remained. And King's campaign in Chicago, it forced the movement to deal with that reality.
It's like, okay, we won some legal battles,
Right.
but there's so much more to this.
Exactly.
So even though the marches were shining a light on this problem,
Yeah.
it was also showing us how deeply entrenched these inequalities were.
Precisely.
It was like peeling back the layers, and there's just so much more going on.
Right. And economic historians,
Okay.
they emphasize how housing segregation trapped black families in these cycles of poverty.
Because they couldn't move out?
Exactly. They were denied access to good jobs,
Right.
quality education, fair housing prices,
Yeah.
all because of where they were forced to live.
That's awful.
It's a vicious cycle that just perpetuates inequality.
Across generations.
Across generations, exactly.
So how did King himself respond to this?
Yeah.
I mean, he was so committed to nonviolence,
Yeah.
but these marches are being met with such aggression.
Yeah, King really wrestled with this.
I bet.
He defended the marches, arguing that a nonviolent movement couldn't survive without bringing about tangible change.
He was saying, we need to see some results from this.
Yeah. He even compared Chicago's discriminatory housing practices
Okay.
to this potential future
Okay.
where black communities would be encircled by hostile white suburbs,
Oh.
further isolating them and limiting their opportunities.
And, in a way, that's kind of what's happened in some places. It's pretty chilling.
It is.
So how did King justify these marches?
Well, he talked about how limited the resources were that were available to the black community in Chicago.
Like they couldn't.
They didn't have the financial resources or the educational opportunities.
Yeah.
And they definitely lacked the political influence to create change through other means.
So they couldn't vote their way out of this.
Not really.
Couldn't buy their way out of this. So
No.
what could they do?
Marching.
Okay.
Despite the controversy and the violence it provoked,
Yeah.
it became a powerful symbol of their struggle. A way to make their voices heard when nothing else was working.
It was almost like they were saying,
Yeah.
we are here. We demand to be heard.
Exactly. And there's this quote from King
Okay.
that really sums this up. He said, we don't have much money or education, and we don't have political power. We have only our bodies. If we hadn't marched, I don't think we'd be here today.
It's powerful.
It is.
Really speaks to the desperation and determination that they must have felt.
Definitely. And not everyone was buying King's message.
Of course not. I mean, this was a pretty controversial
It
thing.
was the Chicago Tribune.
Okay. Big newspaper.
Huge. They labeled King a paid professional agitator,
Oh, wow.
and they criticized him for leading these protests that they said sometimes resulted in violence.
It's like they were trying to discredit him
Yeah.
by making him seem like a troublemaker.
It happens all the time.
Right. But how did King respond to that?
Oh, his response was great.
Okay.
He said, the problem was not the marches, but the conditions that caused people to march.
He was shifting the focus back to the root cause,
Yeah.
those systemic inequalities that made these protests necessary in the first place.
It's a really simple statement,
Yeah.
but it's so profound.
It really resonates even today.
It does.
So looking back,
Yeah.
what was the impact of King's Chicago campaign?
Yeah.
Did he achieve his goals?
Well, it's tricky. On the one hand, the Chicago marches brought national attention to the North,
Right.
broadening the scope of the civil rights movement beyond just the South.
Okay.
But in terms of like concrete change,
Yeah.
the outcomes were more limited compared to those big victories in the South.
So it sounds like King faced a different kind of challenge in the North.
Yeah.
One that wasn't as easy to just,
Right.
fix with legal battles and protests.
Exactly. That deep-rooted economic discrimination,
Right.
coupled with, widespread fear of integration
Yeah.
and a lack of political will, it made it really hard to make meaningful changes in Chicago.
Yeah.
So the campaign showed everyone the problem,
Right.
but it also showed how deep and complicated the issue really was.
It did.
It was like, okay, we're in this for the long haul.
Yeah.
This fight for fair housing and economic justice isn't going away anytime soon.
It wasn't, and I think this realization was a turning point
Okay.
for King and the movement as a whole.
In what way?
The fight for voting rights, desegregation, all that.
Super important.
Absolutely essential, but it wasn't enough.
They needed to go deeper
Yeah.
and address those underlying economic systems that were keeping so many people marginalized.
That's exactly where King's thinking started to evolve,
Interesting.
which led to his Poor People's Campaign,
Oh, right.
a movement that put economic justice and redistribution of wealth right at the center.
So even though the Chicago campaign faced these obstacles and didn't have the same immediate success as some of those Southern campaigns,
Yeah.
it kind of planted the seeds for a much bigger vision of equality.
It did. It forced the movement to confront this really tough truth.
What's that?
True equality couldn't be achieved just by getting rid of those legal barriers.
Right.
They had to tackle the economic systems that kept Black Americans marginalized.
The systems that were holding them back?
Yeah, denying them opportunity.
That's quite a legacy.
It is.
And it really makes you think about the challenges we still face today
It does.
when it comes to,
Yeah,
economic and social justice.
for sure. The fight for equal housing and economic fairness, it's not over.
We've covered a lot of ground here,
We have.
but I think it brings up a really crucial question for all of us listening.
Yeah.
How do these issues of housing discrimination and economic inequality still resonate in today's world? Are we really that different from the Chicago of 1966?
It's a good question. Those forms of discrimination,
Right.
they might have evolved. They're definitely more subtle now,
Yeah.
but those core issues,
Access, opportunity, systemic barriers.
right.
They're still around in a lot of ways.
We see it in the racial wealth gap,
Yeah,
disparities in education,
absolutely.
poverty concentrated in certain neighborhoods.
These are complex issues.
Yeah,
They're all connected,
they are.
and they really demand our attention.
It's kind of sobering, but it's also a call to action.
I agree.
We can't just sit back and watch history happen.
No.
We have to learn from it and apply those lessons to the challenges we're facing today.
I couldn't agree more. Understanding the past, it's how we navigate the present and shape a better future.
And that's what I love about these deep dives.
Yeah.
It's not just about learning facts.
Yeah.
It's about thinking critically,
Yeah,
challenging those assumptions,
absolutely.
and, engaging with the world around us in a more informed and thoughtful way.
Perfectly said.
We've only scratched the surface here,
We have.
but I hope this deep dive has given everyone a good foundation for understanding, the significance of King's Chicago campaign, its complexities, its lasting impact.
It's a fascinating story.
It is. And remember,
Yeah.
this is just one piece of a much larger story.
Right.
So keep exploring,
Keep learning.
keep asking those tough questions,
Yeah.
and keep pushing for a world where those invisible walls of inequality are finally torn down.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.